Today, we welcome guest speaker Dr. Heather Brown and facilitators Ian Wozniak, Program Engagement Co-Facilitator and Autistic Self-Advocate Advisor, and Mirella B., Autistic Self-Advocate Advisor at the Azrieli Center. We are so lucky and excited to have you, and I will hand it over to you.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This is the first of our webinar series, which is going to be focusing on autism and mental health. And today we're going to be focusing on socializing and masking. And my background at CAMH, Program Engagement Co-Facilitator and Self-Advocate. And this topic in particular, things involving socialization, communication, are some of my core interests. So I'm very fortunate to be here and getting a chance to speak with Dr. Brown about this topic. I just want to pass it along to my co-facilitator, Mirella, and she can provide her background.
Hello, welcome everyone. This is our first webinar. We're so excited. My name is Mirella, or Mirella, and I've been a self-advocate for 20 years and more. I have experience working in hospitals and community organizations in Quebec and in Ontario. I'm currently on the advisory board at the Israeli Neurodevelopmental Center. And every month I co-facilitate a workshop for the newly diagnosed at CAMH, and I present sometimes to medical students and professionals alike on various topics. So now, today we'll be hearing from guest speaker Dr. Heather Brown, and we will answer some questions from the audience. Please use the chat box to share any comments or questions you have on the topic, and we will pick the most salient ones and the ones that get repeated. Thank you. Back to Jan.
Great, thanks so much, Mirella. And now I'm just going to introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Heather Brown is an autistic associate professor at the University of Alberta, and a lot of her research focuses on neurodiversity and masking. So on that note, without further ado, I'll welcome Dr. Brown to present your research, and thank you for doing so.
Thank you everyone for having me. I am really, really grateful that I get to be here tonight. I'm very honored that so many of you have come to hear me speak, and I hope that I can do you proud. So today I'm here, obviously, to talk to you about camouflaging and masking. So let me just get my presentation up on the screen. So as you heard, I am Dr. Heather Brown. I'm an associate professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Alberta. And I'm joining you today from Treaty 6 territory, which is the traditional meeting ground of the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, and Nakota Sioux, Blackfoot, and Métis. I am 45 years old, I use she, her pronouns, and I am autistic. I am also of settler colonial ancestry. Given that my heritage extends from the UK, I acknowledge that my ancestors participated in colonization. I continue to benefit from this fact, along with many others with family histories tied to Turtle Island's unjust and unfair colonization. As an academic, I tend to diversify ways of knowing, humbly educate myself, and seek to provide a safe space for all. I have long, straight brown hair and brown eyes, and I am wearing a black top. So any discussion of camouflaging, masking, or anything else that you want to call it has to start with a discussion of autism and stigma. So social and cultural norms, standards, and expectations often engender negative attitudes towards individuals who are experiencing disability. So societal standards that emphasize the desirability of youth, health, athletic prowess, personal appearance, and wholeness, or societies that value personal productivity and achievement are also much more likely to view disabled individuals as a quote-unquote economic burden. So these types of societal beliefs that being abled is normal and preferred is referred to as ableism. and has led to pervasive practices that devalue and discriminate against people with physical, intellectual, or psychiatric disability, and often rests on the assumption that being disabled, that disabled people need to be fixed in one form or another. So in 2020, a researcher named Dr. Grinker described stigma as the unwanted shadow of a person that is produced when society disdains certain human differences, retaining its ancient Greek meaning as a mark or a branding on the body made with a sharp instrument. So the identities of autistic people are often stigmatized at both the individual and the group level. Autistics are commonly stereotyped as being weird or odd, awkward, introverted, withdrawn, obsessive, and if that's not enough, we're also characterized as having difficult personalities, poor emotional intelligence, and quote-unquote ineffectual social skills. So Reeve in 2004 suggested that such stereotypes constitute a form of social oppression, and Dr. Damien Milton entitled that psycho-emotional disablement, which is really hard to say, just in case you were wondering. But anyway, what it really means is that it affects not only these types of stereotypes, they affect not only what people can do, but also what they can ultimately be. So let me give you a really good example. So there's this really clever study done in 2017 where they had a bunch of autistic people and non-autistic people, and they had them basically videotape them. And so they took these really short video clips. They were like 10 to 20 seconds. So you're not really getting any information. And then they asked non-autistic people to rate the desirability or the willingness that they might have to engage with that human. So as you might imagine, when non-autistic people looked at these videos, they often rated the autistic humans who were videotaped as less socially desirable than their non-autistic peers. But then the researchers did something really interesting. They basically took that same information, that same video clip, and they gave it to the same people, and all it was a transcript. You just read what the people were saying. And then they did the exact same thing. They had you judge whether or not, you would socially engage with that individual. And of course, what happened is that when all of those sort of when all you were given were the actual words that we were saying, there were no differences. There was no differences in whether the non-autistics were going to interact with us, which really shows you the point is that they were making these judgments based on 2 to 10 seconds of seeing us interact. So those are what we call thin slice judgments, and people make those types of negative impressions. That type of stuff happens all the time. So this is also a really ridiculously hard thing to say, just in case you were wondering, but it's basically there's this new theory called dialectical misattunement hypothesis. Now, I know that's way too psyche, and I promise I'll stop. But the point is this, is what this sort of hypothesis looks at, is it looks at the fact that the differences in the way that we choose to communicate, the same information, but the way that we actually present that information to others, those differences between neurotypes often are quite incompatible. And because our choices are often incompatible, it leads to all sorts of social hiccups, for lack of a better word. So misalignments occur because a mixed neurotype communicator will, as both partners are struggling to decode unexpected social responses. In other words, neither partner, whether they're autistic or non-autistic, can understand where the other person is coming from. And that misunderstanding or our inability to predict someone else's behavior derails our ability to sort of interact in a very calm, easygoing, no problem manner. So let me give you a really good example. So this was actually a quote that was written in 1959 by someone named Dr. Goffman, who did a lot of this really cool work around stigma. And this is what he sort of described it as. Social interaction treated as a dialogue between two teams may come to an embarrassed and confused halt. The situation may cease to be defined, Previous positions may be no longer tenable, and participants may find themselves without a charted course of action. The participants typically sense a false note in the situation and come to feel awkward, flustered, and literally out of confidence. In other words, the minute social system created and sustained by the orderly social interaction is disorganized. And so what is the point? Well, the point is this, that it's not about our broken social skills. It's not about our inability to understand social norms. It's about the fact that our natural ways of interacting and communicating don't seem intuitive to people of different neurotypes. And then, of course, this becomes very, very problematic for people with autism, because people without autism often have little incentive to try and improve the communication. They simply say, oh, well, there's something wrong with them, and they need to try harder. But that's not actually what's going on. It's not about there's something wrong with us. It's about the fact that both sides need to work to be able to communicate effectively. So, Jan, just so you know, I cannot see I can't see the chat or anything else. So if anyone has a question or you would like me to stop, could you just interrupt me or anything so that I know?
There was one question that came up about the double empathy problem when you were just right after you were talking about Milton's work.
Mm-hmm.
The long worded psychology term that you used.
Yes. What about it? Do you want me to repeat it?
The question was, is this more is this a more fleshed out version of the double empathy problem?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, certainly the double empathy problem was first sort of published around 2012, 2013. And now this sort of dialectical attunement hypothesis is something that's only come out in the last year or two. So yeah, it's definitely building on it, but it's very similar idea. Thank you for that question. It was awesome. Okay, so now let's think about this as autism as a minority identity. So there's a lot of sorry, I'm stumbling all over my words because I want to say a million different things and I don't know which one I want to say first. So let me say this one. There's this really cool study by this Catherine Crompton that was able to show experimentally that people with autism actually just have different social skills, not necessarily broken ones. And then from that work and from Damien Milton works and a whole bunch of Nick Walker, there's lots of people who are sort of trying to understand autism as a cultural difference as opposed to a necessarily disabling difference. Now, of course, there are always aspects of autism which may or may not be disabling to any given person. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm not trying to say that autism is always roses, but there's a lot of parts about autism where we just naturally have different sort of inclinations on how we're going to want to behave. And from that perspective, you might consider autism more like a culture than necessarily a disability. So if you're willing to go with me on this, let me explain why this matters. So when two cultures start to interact, and please forgive me because I'm a little bit rough on this. I'm a psychologist. I'm not totally an anthropologist, but I'm going to nonetheless do my best. When two cultures tend to intermix, especially when you have a minority culture intermixing with a dominant one, we often talk about something like, sorry, there was a little text came up on my screen and it distracted me. Anyway, when we're, now I have no idea what I'm saying. Okay, sorry. During acculturation, that's what I'm saying. Acculturation is this process that we often talk about when a minority identity is trying to intermix with the majority. And basically, during acculturation, opportunities for independence, they often differ between members of the larger society and the acculturating individuals. So in this case, between non-autistic majority and autistic people. And these differences generate social conflicts between groups and psychological conflicts within individuals. Now, there are 6 dimensions of cultural variation that often have a really important influence on how individuals are going to interact during acculturation. And these 6 variables are here on the screen, and I'm not going to read them all because what I really want to tell you is what they're like for people with autism. But you can see what they are there. So diversity, equality, conformity, wealth, space, and time. Now, I must say that these are all based on the assumption that non-dominant groups and their individual members have the freedom to choose how they want to engage in intercultural relations. And clearly that's not necessarily the case, but nonetheless, let's see what happens next. So if we extend this argument to autistic acculturation to the non-autistic majority, we know that autistics hold lower social status, we receive fewer opportunities and rewards, we have less wealth, and we are expected to adhere to the system of norms and social obligations of the non-autistic majority. As well, each group holds innate differences in what is considered appropriate interpersonal distancing for a social exchange, as well as in the meaning and use of time. So it's perhaps unsurprising that many autistics could be said to be struggling with what is called acculturated stress in response to intercultural contact. That's a lot of words, eh? Apologize. So let's think about what this socialization means in the context of acculturation. So if you look at its actual definition, socialization occurs when we ask any individual to closely observe and then imitate a behavior, usually through deliberate and systematic shaping. In other words, it's the continuous collaboration of elders and novices and old hands and newcomers in the acquisition of honing of skills important for meeting the demands of group life. But the crucial factor here is hinging on this notion of voluntary versus compelled socialization. When the dominant group enforces certain kinds of relations or constrains the choices of the non-dominant group, then separation, assimilation, or marginalization are much more likely to occur. In fact, individuals struggling with acculturated stress from this contact cannot be dealt with easily, and so autistics are going to need to find other strategies to cope. So I'm going to pause again. How am I doing there, Jan?
I think that you're currently pretty good. There's just a lot of questions between some of the attendees, which is great. But this is great. Continue.
Okay, perfect. So what is this thing called impression management, and why does any of us use it? So Goffman in 1959 said that impression management refers to the universal human inclination to foster a good impression of oneself in the eyes of others. It's transactional in nature, and it occurs when an actor projects a social character that hopefully aligns with their audience's expectations and values, much like I'm doing right now. The interaction is multifaceted, and it includes many self-enhancement and social communication strategies. So for autistics, impression management generally involves 4 related skills: self-preservation, camouflaging, self-concealment, and self-monitoring. In self-preservation, those are the intentional behaviors that we use that are aimed to project a favorable public self-image, and it might include proactive strategies like self-promotion or ingratiation, or defensive strategies like disclaimers or justifications or apologies. And I do the apology one way too much. Camouflaging refers to both verbal and nonverbal strategies that are used by autistics to conform to the conventions of non-autistic social behavior. Self-concealment involves hiding of stigmatized autism-associated traits or any other socially unacceptable information, such as atypical interests or atypical or overly intense emotional reactions from non-autistic peers. And then that very last, successful impression management, it requires high self-monitoring to be able to keep track of and flexibly modify verbal and nonverbal behaviors in response to signals from the social environment. So Recently, one of my master's students, Nick Denemy, and I ran a study on camouflaging. And so I'm going to, throughout this presentation, share with you a bunch of different quotes that many of the participants said to us. So this was one that I thought was really cool. Many of the participants in our study talked about how camouflaging is communication. And so one participant said, I like to think of it along the same lines as if you're like when you're learning a new language. You like put in a ton of extra effort and the amount of work to learn how to properly communicate with people in your space, because that's the best way to build a solid foundation of a relationship. I'm not camouflaging my autism. Instead, I'm learning how to speak neurotypical. And that was really powerful to me, because that is a much better way to understand what camouflaging is. And it completely changed my understanding of what I thought camouflaging was. Quick break. Jan, any questions?
There's not any particular questions right now, but I feel like a lot of the attendees are mentioning the fact that it's really the sort of the effect of having, you know, individuals that they can relate to. So like having the personal experience, like all these individuals coming together is sort of a welcoming experience. Someone had mentioned the word healing, and I don't know if there's anything that you'd like to comment on that, about that sort of universal experience.
Say that again. I didn't quite understand the question.
No, I was wondering if you could provide some feedback on some of the attendees are mentioning like the importance of community or having sort of everyone come together in a single area.
Yes, so community is huge, and we're going to talk a lot about community when we get to the end. But you're right, like having a safe space or having a community, it means a lot. Actually, we're going to talk about community right now. So let me do that. So I got to move the picture down so it goes away. Okay, there we go. Okay. So it's very important to remember that impression management is used by everyone. It's used by all neurotypes in order to promote social integration and belonging, and to mitigate the impact of holding any stigmatized identity, being disabled being only one. So what we know is that peer victimization is practically endemic among autistic youth. So Wood and Gadko in 2010 proposed that the overabundance of autism-specific stressors, such as social confusion, bullying, social isolation, peer rejection, limited opportunities, all of these types and many more often engender what we call a traumatic conditioning process in autistic youth. The emotional pain and stress from past experiences of social exclusion will initiate these internal social monitoring processes and can lead to hypervigilance for possible social threats among those who are experiencing a stigmatized identity. So Goffin in 1963, he defined the process of concealment as the impact that conscious and unconscious norms and societal expectations place upon stigmatized persons, and the lengths that they may go to conceal their otherness. For many autistics, impression management can become a survival strategy through camouflaging and self-concealment, and it can often reflect a traumatic response. Autistics who camouflage regularly may have internalized the stigma that their natural autistic tendencies are not acceptable ways to behave. For example, one participant in my study with Nick described that there is often shame associated with stimming and displaying other obvious autistic traits. This individual said, "It's embarrassing to see how people stare at us or make offhanded comments, and you know that they're commenting. At the same time, there's often benefits to using camouflaging or other impression management techniques. So impression management is driven by our need for social acceptance and belonging, and for our desire for friendships, because all of these things facilitate our mental well-being. Impression management involves the intentional, in-the-moment use of cognitive resources to secure social affiliation, to improve social relationships with others, to seek out employment opportunities, and to achieve academic success. So as this participant said, learning to speak neurotypical allows you to be able to make more authentic connections with people. When you make your own language accessible to them, it helps you to really understand other people's experiences. And going right back to that comment, Jan, Leary and colleagues in 1995, they argued that your self-esteem system is actually functioning like a sociometer that's monitoring the degree to which the individual is being included versus excluded by other people. And it motivates the person to behave in ways that minimize the probability of rejection or exclusion. In other words, experiencing success in social environments both feels good in the moment and over time, and such success will often bolster our sense of self-worth. Oh, I see what I've done. I've turned on some kind of weird, isn't it weird how all these programs work just a little bit differently? So now the caveat to all of those positives that I just gave you is that we actually do need to feel safe to unmask with our partners and our friends if we actually want to form fulfilling relationships. For example, one participant in our study reported, "I'm trying really hard not to mask anymore. I don't want to lose those relationships in my life. I don't want those relationships in my life where I can't be who I am. I will do it strategically when I need to, keep my job. But if you can't accept me for what I need to be, then I don't want to be in that relationship." But we're going to come back to that caveat in just a moment. So now I'm going to talk about some of the consequences of impression management. And there's both positive and negative consequences. But before I do that, Jan, is there anything you need me to address?
Yeah, there was one question about, I'm just going to read the end. Is there any research on this effect to support not perpetuating the ABA ideal of teaching autistic kids to act neurotypically?
So there's a bunch of research that's looking at the effects of ABA and when is ABA, especially with regards to teaching social skills, like around peers and whatnot. There is a bunch of research going on right now looking at that. And I am going to cover a little bit about that when we talk about the very last part of my presentation. We're going to talk about when it's good to mask and when it's not. So let me come back to that. So consequences. And like I said, there's going to be positives and negatives. So the negatives. Impression management can lead to in-the-moment feelings of inauthenticity. It can lead to tired, exhaustion, anxiety, and shame. There's also a bunch of longer-term consequences as well. It's possible that you could end up sorry, I'm stumbling over my words. I hate when I do that. So let me start again. There's also a bunch of longer-term consequences that may be associated with autism, such as identity confusion, as well as an increase in mental health conditions, especially around anxiety, depression, burnout, and suicidality. But we need to make a really important point here before we go on. We don't know the direction of these effects. We don't know what came first. It's possible that people were already feeling a great deal of shame, depression, anxiety, and so on, which led them to do more camouflaging, which led and so on and so forth. So we can't make any kind of definitive statements at this time of which direction these relationships are going, but these relationships do exist. One of the reasons that this can be so hard for us is because the incompatibility between our natural autistic selves and the societal expectations can lead to a huge mismatch between the autistic identity and the socially idealized persona. In other words, it leads to having us to do a lot more things to manage. And there's a whole bunch of sort of computational constraints that hinder our ability to realize that persona, like me stumbling over my words right now as my working memory struggles to try and keep up with all these complicated ideas. So, like I said, while causal patterns are unclear, this constant maintenance of this facade of normality is often reported to be associated with feelings of worthlessness, exhaustion, and decreased mental health. And so in one of the most famous researchers in this area, Dr. Hull, one of her autistic participants said, "It's mentally exhausting constantly having to be someone else, literally never being able to be myself, and kind of sad too." So like I said, autistics who regularly camouflage may have internalized the stigma that their natural autistic tendencies are not acceptable ways to behave. And this type of if you've internalized that, and it can lead to really intense hypervigilance. And that hypervigilance is really easy to see in this particular participant's reflection. And so in this one, camouflaging for her meant constant overthinking of the possibilities of what to say, how it will come across, what others are and are not saying, the connotations of every word, sentence structure, emphasis, body language, as well as all of the above combined into a giant matrix of thought. So it's very little wonder that so many of us end up with co-occurring anxiety disorders. Many autistic advocates and proponents of the neurodiversity movement rightly suggest that autistics should not have to work so hard to pass as neurotypical in order to achieve success at home, work, or school. Instead, they advocate for autistics to be able to remain true to themselves. But on the other hand, autistic youth and adults are often judged unfairly and or viewed as less competent because we behave in ways that quote unquote appear odd. And as such, the participants in our study viewed the ability to camouflage as a privilege because hiding certain thoughts, feelings, and emotions can help shield us from the negative perceptions of others. For example, one autistic participant in our study said, "I think camouflaging keeps me safe. It's kind of like a curtain, and it hides me from the prying eyes of people who are not as educated, are judgmental, or is not as informed about autism or really anyone different." So impression management may be also associated with a host of positive consequences. Because like increased social harmony, because you feel more connected to others, or a sense of pride in your social acumen, or you might have increased life satisfaction and well-being because you've been afforded the same social, academic, and or career opportunities as everyone else. And so this is the very last portion of the planned presentation, and then I'm happy to answer some of your questions. And what we're going to discuss now is, okay, so you've sort of laid out very briefly. I know I could spend like 3 hours actually laying this out, but very briefly, I've sort of given you some of the key ideas. But now let's think about, well, when do we decide? Okay, you've said that it can lead to negatives, you said that it can lead to positives, so how do I know what I'm supposed to do? But before I do that, Jan, any questions?
Just for the sake of time, I think we're going to let you continue, and then we can open it up to some questions, if that's okay.
No problem. Okay. So one of the things that appears to be most important if you're going to choose to camouflage or not is it really depends on what strategy you choose to use. So let me tell you what I mean. So we have long known, and if you're into CBT, you're probably going to know what I'm talking about. But regardless, bear with me. What we know about, there's something called expressive suppression. And basically, that's a strategy where individuals try to hide or conceal their emotional expressions without actually altering their emotional experience. So many autistic people are often really hypersensitive to incoming sensations that include smells, lights, and sounds. But you, like me, were probably told repeatedly growing up that our sensory needs were unreasonable because, quote unquote, genes are not scratchy, because we're overreacting, because it isn't that cold, or because we're overly sensitive. Why don't you just take things less personally? And so as a result of all this social conditioning, we often feel intense pressure to hide signs of our emotional distress. So this expressive suppression is often used by autistic participants. So let me give you an example. One of the participants in our study described suppressing the urge to gag after smelling something terrible because of her worry that gagging is going to draw unwanted attention. Another participant reported that she was about being able to hide her distress during, Another participant reported that she wasn't able to hide her distress during moments of sensory overwhelm, or her ability to do so had actually given her the life that she had today. But even so, evidence shows that over time, suppression can actually heighten your psychological response to your emotions. In other words, the more you tell yourself, and this one has been so hard for me to learn myself, but the more you tell yourself, I shouldn't be anxious, I shouldn't be anxious, I don't need to be anxious, you're actually just making yourself more anxious. Suppression's overall cost may actually depend upon how burdensome or inauthentic it feels to conceal your true emotions. But nevertheless, the habitual use of suppression has been linked to feelings of fatigue, low self-esteem, and increased levels of psychopathology, all of which suggests that suppression is a costly emotional regulation strategy, and it often results in lower well-being. So if your strategy to sort of cope or mask is going to be expressive suppression, you'll find that masking is going to be much more costly to your overall mental health. Oops, I think I went, oh, there we go. So let me tell you a better strategy. And this strategy is sort of based on the idea of cognitive reappraisal, which is another CBT strategy. But I gave it my own funny little twist because I always have to make myself laugh, because that honestly is the best way for me to cope. So this is what one autistic participant said. And she was talking about whether or not she should mask when she's dating. And so she was, and basically what she was trying to say is that she would basically mask a little bit at the beginning, but she would very soon take the mask off. And so this was her quote. I would say by, like, the third date, oh, by the way, I'm autistic, because I assume by the third date, we're kind of getting a little serious, I got a lot of negative reactions that were pretty gross. And there was a point where I didn't want to tell anyone that I was autistic that I was dating. But then I thought, no, that's crap. Because I don't want to be with someone who reacts negatively when they find out I'm autistic. Why would I want to be with someone like that in my life or in my space? So it's kind of a really nice way to weed out the jerks. And that is awesome. That's perfect. That's exactly what we want to do. We want to try and cognitively reframe the situation and then be able to just cope. In conclusion, we have to remember that fitting in and belonging are two very different things. Fitting in requires changing who you need to be in order to be accepted. Belonging means being accepted just as you are. So clinicians and service providers and families need to learn to ensure that autistic people are not coerced into learning social skills for the sake of the neurotypical people with whom we interact. At the same time, we can all support those autistic people who are genuinely motivated to learn how to speak neurotypical to achieve various self-chosen outcomes, like to be a more effective communicator in a workplace that is dominated by non-autistics. And last, we need to encourage autistic people to join groups of other non-neurodivergent peers with similar interests, because members of such groups often feel great kinship for one another. And neurodivergent groups provide opportunities for meaningful friendships without needing us to mask or normalize our so-called odd behaviors.